She arrived at Ashford Park with one trunk, no maid, and a bruise on her wrist she had been hiding for 3 days. The carriage ride had taken nearly 4 hours, and she had spent most of it watching the countryside blur past the window, telling herself she was not afraid. She was not afraid of the house. She was not afraid of the Duke. She was not afraid of what her mother had said to her the night before, in that low and certain voice that left no room for argument. "You will go, you will be grateful, and you will not embarrass us." Marian had nodded. She was very good at nodding. The carriage slowed as the iron gates of Ashford Park came into view, and she sat up straighter without thinking, an old habit, trained into her spine long before she understood why. The house appeared at the end of a long gravel drive, stone-faced and vast, its windows catching the gray morning light like a row of unblinking eyes. She did not know that the Duke of Ashford was watching from one of those windows. He was not supposed to be home. He had told his steward he would be riding until noon, but something had made him turn back early, a restlessness he could not name, and he had come in through the side entrance just as the carriage rolled to a stop on the drive below. He looked down. A young woman stepped out alone. No maid followed. No second trunk was unloaded. She stood for a moment in the cold air, and he watched her pull her sleeve down over her left wrist with a small, practiced movement that she clearly did not realize anyone could see. The Duke of Ashford was not a man given to quick impressions. But he did not move from the window. The first person to speak to Marian at Ashford Park was not the butler. It was a young housemaid named Peggy, no older than 16, who appeared at the top of the front steps before Marian had even reached them, and who looked at her with wide and earnest eyes and said, quite simply, "Oh, miss, you must be tired. Come in out of the cold." Marian stopped walking. She could not have explained later why those words affected her so much. They were ordinary words. They meant almost nothing, but she had not heard anything quite like them in a very long time, and she stood there on the gravel drive for just a moment too long, her trunk sitting behind her, the cold wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair. Come in out of the cold. As if her comfort were the natural and obvious concern. She followed Peggy inside. The entrance hall of Ashford Park was the largest room Marian had ever stood in. The ceilings rose to a height that made her feel very small, and the floors were pale marble, and a great staircase curved upward at the far end with the quiet confidence of something that had existed for centuries, and expected to exist for centuries more. Everything was very clean and very still and smelled faintly of beeswax, and something she could not identify, something almost like warmth, which she knew was not a smell but which she could not think of another word for. She was looking up at the ceiling when the housekeeper arrived. Mrs. Holt was a tall woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back precisely, and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once in her life allowed herself to slouch. She walked toward Marian with a measured and unhurried step, and when she reached her, she looked at her for a moment with an expression that Marian could not quite read. Not unkind, not dismissive, something else. Something almost like recognition. "Miss Voss," she said, and her voice was low and even. "Welcome to Ashford Park. I am Mrs. Holt. I manage the household." "Thank you," Marian said. I hope I hope I have not caused any inconvenience." It was the kind of thing she had been taught to say, preemptive apology. She was very practiced at it. Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "No inconvenience at all," she said. "Your room is ready. Peggy will take you up." It was not a remarkable thing to say. And yet Marian had the strange and unsettling feeling, as she followed Peggy up the great staircase, that Mrs. Holt had wanted to say something else entirely. Her room was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that overlooked the east garden. It was not a grand room, but it was a good one. A real fire already burning in the grate, a bed with clean white linens, a window seat with a faded cushion in blue and cream. Someone had placed a small vase of winter greenery on the dressing table. Nothing exotic, just sprigs of something green against the gray day outside. Marian set her bag down and stood very still in the middle of the room. Peggy lingered at the door. "Is everything all right, miss? Is there anything you need?" "No," Marian said, and then, because the girl was still looking at her with that open and uncomplicated concern, "It is a very nice room, thank you." Peggy smiled and closed the door softly behind her. Marian sat down on the edge of the bed. She pressed her hands together in her lap very carefully and looked at the fire, and did not allow herself to cry. She was not sad exactly. She could not name what she was. Only that this room, this ordinary, quiet, adequate room, was the first place in recent memory where she had been given something without immediately being told what it was going to cost her. She did not know, as she sat there watching the fire, that the Duke of Ashford had just come in from the corridor. She did not know that he had passed her door and paused, just for a moment at the sound of silence, where he might have expected weeping. She did not know that he had stood there for 3 full seconds before continuing on. But he had. And he had not forgotten the wrist. The Duke of Ashford did not make a habit of watching his guests. He was not that kind of man. He had no interest in gossip, no patience for the drawing-room theater that occupied most of the aristocracy he was obliged to tolerate, and he had long ago learned that observing people too closely only resulted in knowing things about them that he would have preferred not to know. And yet, he found himself at dinner that evening acutely aware of where Marian Voss was sitting. She had been placed at the far end of the table, not insultingly far, but far enough to signal that no one had thought carefully about where she should go. The dining room at Ashford Park was built for 30, and that evening held only 4. The Duke himself, his estate steward Mr. Callum, who occasionally dined at the house on business, a distant cousin named Fitch who was visiting for reasons the Duke had already forgotten, and Marian. She was dressed plainly. Not poorly, the gown was of decent enough fabric, but plainly in a way that suggested either poverty or a long habit of making herself unremarkable. Her hair was neat. Her posture was very straight. She kept her eyes on her plate. Cousin Fitch talked about horses for 20 minutes without pausing. Mr. Callum discussed the drainage situation on the North Field, which the Duke generally found tedious, but tonight found positively restful by comparison. Marian said nothing. The Duke noted this. Not her silence, some people were simply quiet, but the particular quality of it. She was not bored, she was not shy, she was careful. There was a difference, and it was one he had learned to see. She was calculating at every moment how much space she was allowed to take up. It was toward the end of the second course that it happened. A new set of cutlery had been placed for the fish, and Marian's hand moved toward the wrong fork, not by much, only by an inch, and then stopped. Completely still. A pause so brief that no one else at the table would have noticed it. She did not reach for the wrong fork. She simply waited, hand withdrawn to her lap, as if she had decided she did not need it after all. Mrs. Holt, who was overseeing the service from near the sideboard, moved. It was a small movement, barely 3 steps, and she set the correct fork down beside Marian's plate without a word, without drawing attention, without breaking the flow of the room in any way. As if she had been watching for exactly this. As if she had known. Marian looked up at her for just a moment, a look of quiet, almost startled gratitude that she quickly smoothed away. Mrs. Holt returned to the sideboard. The Duke set down his wine glass very slowly. In 14 years of running this household, through dinners for 30, through visiting lords and their difficult wives, through his own mother's relentless and exhausting standards of precision, he had never once seen Mrs. Holt move like that for a guest. Not like that, not with that particular quality of care, the kind that did not want to be seen doing it. He said nothing. But after dinner, When the others had moved to the drawing room and Marian had excused herself early with a quiet word that no one questioned, the Duke went not to the drawing room but to the library. He told himself it was because he had correspondence to attend to. It was not because of correspondence. The household records at Ashford Park were kept in a series of leather-bound volumes on the lower shelves of the library, organized by year. The Duke had looked at them perhaps twice in his adult life, both times for practical reasons involving property boundaries. He pulled out the volume from 23 years ago and set it on the desk. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for. He told himself he was simply curious about Mrs. Holt's history of service. She had been with the household long before he inherited. It was reasonable to want to understand his own staff. He turned the pages slowly. The records were meticulous: names, dates, positions, wages. Footmen and housemaids and kitchen girls listed in a precise and faded hand. He ran his finger down the columns, not yet knowing what would stop him. And then something did. A name, listed under housemaid, starting 24 years ago and ending abruptly, mid-year, with a single word in the margin written in a different hand than the rest. Dismissed. The name was not Holt. The surname was Voss. The Duke sat back in his chair. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he looked at the date she had been dismissed. Then he did a calculation that was simple enough that he wished, almost immediately, that he had not done it. He closed the book. He sat in the library for a while longer, looking at the fire. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep well. Upstairs, in the room at the end of the east corridor, Marian sat at the small writing desk by the window and began a letter to no one in particular. A habit she had developed years ago, writing letters she never sent, to people she could not say things to out loud. She wrote about the drive, the iron gates, the marble floor. She wrote, "The housekeeper looked at me as though she knew me. I am certain we have never met." She wrote, "The fire in my room was already lit when I arrived. I do not know why that is the thing I keep thinking about." She folded the paper and put it in the small box she kept at the bottom of her trunk, beneath everything else. Then she lay down, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and listened to the house settle around her in the dark, its old beams shifting, its stone walls holding the cold at bay, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the walls around her were not a trap. She was asleep before she could examine that feeling too closely. Down the hall, a door that had been slightly ajar was quietly pulled shut. They arrived on a Thursday without warning. Marian was in the garden when she heard the carriage, or rather, she heard the particular sound of gravel displaced with unnecessary force, which was how her mother had always preferred to arrive anywhere, as if the ground itself should know she was coming. She stood up slowly from where she had been crouching beside a dormant rose bed, brushing the soil from her gloves, and watched the black carriage roll to a stop at the front of the house. Her mother stepped out first. Mrs. Voss was a handsome woman in the way that certain cold things are handsome, precise, well-maintained, assembled with great care for effect. She wore deep green today, with a hat that was slightly too large for the occasion and exactly right for the impression she wished to make. She looked at the front of Ashford Park with the expression of a woman calculating the distance between where she stood and where she felt she deserved to be. Then came Cecily. Marian's half-sister was 2 years younger and 4 inches taller, and she descended from the carriage with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in her life been made to feel she was taking up too much space. She was pretty in a bright and obvious way, with her mother's eyes and considerably more warmth in their expression, though that warmth, Marian had learned long ago, was largely ornamental. Neither of them looked toward the garden. Marian did not call out. She pulled off her gloves slowly, one finger at a time, and went inside through the side door. She learned later from Peggy, who had the particular gift of knowing everything that happened in a house within minutes of its happening, that her mother had announced the visit to the butler as though she had been invited, that she had commented on the entrance hall in a tone that managed to be both admiring and faintly critical, and that she had asked, within the first 5 minutes, whether the Duke was at home. He was. He received them in the drawing room. Marian arrived last, having changed out of her garden dress, and she entered the room to find her mother already arranged in the best chair by the fire, Cecily beside her on the settee looking decorative, and the Duke standing at the window with a cup of tea he did not appear to be drinking. Marian, asterisk her mother said in that voice, warm on the surface with something harder underneath like snow over stone. There you are. We were beginning to wonder. I was in the garden, Marian said. In this cold, her mother turned to the Duke with a small, apologetic smile. She has always been terribly impractical. I do hope she has not been any trouble, Your Grace. None whatsoever, the Duke said. He said it without inflection, without the reassuring warmth her mother had clearly been angling for. Just the words, flat and final, and then he took a sip of his tea and looked out the window again. Her mother adjusted. She was very good at adjusting. Lunch was served at 1 o'clock. Marian had spent enough years at her mother's table to know how these meals worked. There was a rhythm to them, a particular and well-practiced choreography of small humiliations, and her role in that choreography had always been the same. She was the contrast, the backdrop against which Cecily shone. Cecily has been getting on so beautifully this season, asterisk her mother said, helping herself to a second portion of the ragout. 3 invitations to Pemberton House alone. Lady Pemberton has taken quite a shine to her. How pleasant, said the Duke. Marian, of course, prefers to keep to herself, a light laugh. She has always been the quiet one, bookish. One does one's best. Marian reached for her water glass. I was not aware, said the Duke, without looking up from his plate. That reading was a quality requiring an apology. A small silence. Her mother's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. Of course not. I only meant. Tell me, Miss Voss, the Duke said, and now he did look up and he looked directly at Marian. What are you reading at present? Marian blinked. In 23 years of family dinners, no one had ever redirected a conversation toward her. She was so unprepared for it that she almost did not answer in time. Gibbon, she said, the Decline and Fall, I found it in your library. I hope that was not presumptuous. Not at all, he said. What do you make of it? And so she told him. She spoke for perhaps 3 minutes about Gibbon, about the particular chapter she had been reading, about a question it had raised for her regarding the nature of institutional decay, whether it was always slow, or whether there were moments when the speed of collapse could surprise even those watching for it. She had not spoken that many consecutive sentences at a table in years. When she stopped, the Duke was looking at her with an expression she could not read. Her mother was looking at her too, but that expression she knew very well. Cecily was examining her fork. Quite right, the Duke said quietly, and returned to his plate. They stayed until 4 o'clock. In that time, Marian's mother managed to mention twice that Marian had never really taken to society, once that she had been a difficult child, and once, with a small, practiced laugh, that they had really done their very best with her given the circumstances. The Duke said very little. He listened. He refilled his own tea once. He asked Cecily 2 polite questions about her season and received 2 polished answers that told him nothing. He asked the steward to have the carriage brought round at 3:45. When her mother rose to leave, she took Marian's hand in both of hers, a gesture that looked, from a distance, like affection. You will write, she said. Yes, Marian said. And you will remember what we discussed. This was said very quietly, meant only for Marian. Her mother's hands were warm and her grip was firm, and her eyes were pleasant and entirely without feeling. "Yes," Marion said again. She stood in the entrance hall and watched the carriage roll away down the gravel drive, her hands folded in front of her face composed. She did not hear the Duke come to stand beside her until he spoke. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very even, "will not be receiving another invitation to this house." Marion turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the gate where the carriage had disappeared. "She was not invited this time," Marion said before she could stop herself. A pause. "No," he said, "she was not." He turned then and walked back toward the library, and Marion stood alone in the entrance hall, the cold air from the closing door still moving around her, feeling something shift in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. Behind her at the top of the staircase, Peggy stood very still with a pile of folded linen in her arms, watching. And further down the corridor, the door to Mrs. Holt's sitting room, which had been open an inch, was very quietly closed. The Duke did not sleep that night either. He lay in the dark for an hour, listening to the house, and then gave up the pretense entirely and went down to the library in his dressing gown with a candle, the way he had not done since he was 12 years old, and reading adventure novels he was not supposed to have. The leather-bound volume was where he had left it. He did not open it immediately. He sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. He had not bothered to light it and looked at the cover for a while, as though it might tell him something without requiring him to look inside. Then he opened it. He had already found the name. He did not need to find it again. What he needed now was to follow it, to understand not just that a woman named Voss had worked in this house 24 years ago, but who she had been, and what the single word asterisk dismissed in the margin actually meant. He went back further, 25 years, 26. He found her first entry, a housemaid, age 19, hired in the spring. Good references. Neat handwriting in the original letter of application, which had been folded and tucked into the back of the volume by someone who kept everything. Her name was Agnes Voss. He looked at the date she was dismissed. He looked at the date again. Then he went to the next volume, the one from the following year, and found what he was not quite sure he had been hoping to find. A record of a child. Not in the household accounts. In a different section at the back of the volume, in his late father's handwriting, a handwriting he would have known anywhere, having spent much of his childhood trying to imitate it. A brief notation, the kind his father made when he wished to record something without quite committing it to formal documentation. A hedge against both acknowledgement and denial. Child born to A.V. March, arrangements made, matter closed. The Duke sat with that for a long time. Matter closed. He thought about Marion at dinner, reaching for the wrong fork and then going still. He thought about her mother's hand on hers in the entrance hall, warm and gripless and proprietary all at once. He thought about the way she had spoken about Gibbon, not to impress him, not performing intelligence for an audience, but simply because she had been thinking about it and someone had finally asked. He thought about the bruise on her wrist on the day she arrived. He closed both volumes and sat in the cold library for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, which was how he thought about the things that mattered most. He found Mrs. Holt the next morning before breakfast. She was in the linen room off the back corridor, doing an inventory with the calm and thoroughness she brought to everything, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway without surprise, which told him that she had been expecting this conversation for some time. He closed the door behind him. "Agnes Voss," he said. Mrs. Holt set down her ledger. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had long ago made peace with the weight of it. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "You knew her." "I did. We worked together for 3 years. She was a good person, quiet, careful. She worked very hard and asked for very little. And my father. It was not a question. Mrs. Holt received it as one anyway. Your father was not a cruel man, she said carefully. But he was not always a careful one. And Agnes was very young, and this was a very large house, and she had no one to tell her how these things could go. The Duke looked at the wall. She was dismissed. When it became apparent, yes, a pause, your father made arrangements, money, a placement in another household in another county. She was told never to return and never to speak of it. And the child. Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment. She kept her, she said. I did not know that for many years. I lost track of Agnes entirely after she left. It was only later, much later, that I heard she had married. A Mr. Voss. A respectable man, I believe, though not a wealthy one. He died when the child was still small. And the child's name, the Duke said. Marian, asterisk, said Mrs. Holt. The words sat between them in the small room, among the folded linens and the smell of lavender, and the ordinary quiet of a morning that had become something else entirely. She does not know, the Duke said. No. You have known since she arrived. I knew her the moment I saw her, Mrs. Holt said, and her voice was perfectly even, but her hands, the Duke noticed, had tightened slightly against each other. She has his eyes, your father's eyes, the shape of them. I would have known her anywhere. The Duke said nothing. I did not know how to tell her, Mrs. Holt continued. I did not know if it was my place. I did not know, she stopped, composed herself. She has not had an easy time of it, Your Grace. That much is clear without anyone needing to say it. No, he said, it is clear. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the house, he could hear the distant sound of a door opening, footsteps in the corridor, Marian, perhaps, going down to breakfast. The ordinary sound of someone moving through a house that was, by every right he was only now fully understanding, partly hers. She will need to be told, he said. Yes. I will need to think about how. Yes, Your Grace. He turned to go, then stopped. Mrs. Holt. Your Grace. The vase of winter greenery in her room, on the first day. A pause. I thought she might like something living, Mrs. Holt said simply. He nodded once and left. Marian spent that morning in the library. She had nearly finished the Gibbon and had found, on the shelf beside it, a volume of letters. Real letters, historical ones, written between two people she had never heard of, but who had clearly loved each other with great practicality and very little sentimentality, which she found more moving than most declarations she had encountered. She was deep in the middle of it when the Duke came in. She looked up, he looked at her, and for just a moment, a single, unguarded moment, there was something in his expression that she did not know how to read. Not pity, not the cool appraisal she had grown used to from men of his position, something more uncomfortable than either of those things, something that looked almost like. He looked away first. Good morning, he said, moving toward his desk. Good morning, she said. He sat, he opened a letter. She returned to her book. They sat in the same room for the better part of an hour, not speaking, and it was the most comfortable Marian had felt in the presence of another person in as long as she could remember. Which was, of course, precisely when it went wrong. She found him still at his desk when she came back after luncheon. She had not intended to say anything. She had intended to return her book to its shelf and go back to the east corridor and the unremarkable safety of her room. But she was almost to the shelf when she noticed that he was not reading the letter in front of him. He was looking at it, but his eyes were still, and the page had not turned, and he had the expression of a man who was somewhere else entirely. She put the book on the shelf. Then, because she had spent 23 years saying nothing, and she was very tired, she said, You have been looking at me differently since yesterday. He looked up. I do not mean at dinner, she said. I mean since this morning, since before breakfast." She kept her voice very level. "I have had a great deal of practice noticing when someone knows something about me that I do not know myself. It is an expression I recognize." He set the letter down. For a moment she thought he would deny it. People usually denied it. "Sit down," he said instead, "please." She sat. And he told her. He told her quietly and without ornament, which she appreciated more than she could say. He did not soften it into something shapeless. He gave her the facts in the order he had found them, and he watched her face while he spoke, and he did not look away. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Marian looked at the fireplace. The fire had burned down to a low and steady glow, and she looked at it for a long time, and she thought about her mother's hand on hers in the entrance hall, and she thought about the word asterisk circumstances, and she thought about all the years of being made to feel that she was something slightly less than she should be, and she understood now that this had been, in some essential way, deliberate. She had not been an embarrassment. She had been a secret. There was a difference, and it was a difference that rearranged everything she thought she had known about her own history. "Mrs. Holt," she said finally. "She has known since you arrived." "The greenery," Marian said softly, almost to herself. "In the room." "Yes." She looked at him then, and she could feel, even as she did it, that her expression had shifted into something harder than she intended, something defensive, which she hated but could not seem to stop. "And you," she said, "what do you intend to do with this?" He frowned slightly. "I beg your pardon." "This information." She kept her voice even. "You are a duke. I am apparently your late father's natural daughter, which makes me an inconvenience at best and a scandal at worst. You have found this out. So I am asking, what do you intend to do with it?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I had not yet decided," he said. "Then I will make it easier for you," she said, and she stood up, and she met his eyes, and she said the thing she had been thinking since the moment he had started speaking. "Whatever is decided, I want no part of any arrangement that requires me to be managed. I have been managed my entire life, and I am very tired of it." She set her book on the table between them with a small and final sound. And she walked out. The Duke sat in the library for a long time after she left, looking at the book she had put down, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that he had handled something badly. He was not accustomed to the feeling. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not like it at all. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning. The Duke recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he had fully picked it up, that particular combination of careful elegance and underlying aggression that characterized everything Mrs. Voss put on paper. He opened it at his desk, read it once, and then set it down and looked out the window for a while at the gray winter sky. Then he read it again. It was, on the surface, a perfectly reasonable letter, courteous, even warm in the way that Mrs. Voss did warmth as a tool rather than a feeling. She wrote that she had so enjoyed her recent visit to Ashford Park. She wrote that she had long admired his Grace's family and his management of the estate. She wrote that she had been giving a great deal of thought to Marian's situation, and that she wished to propose, with all appropriate discretion, a conversation of a practical nature. She wished to come on Tuesday. She wished to bring her solicitor. The Duke put the letter in his desk drawer and sent no reply. He did not tell Marian about the letter immediately. He told himself this was because he had not yet decided how to handle it. This was partially true. He was also, he acknowledged privately, unwilling to watch her face do what it had done in the library, that particular closing down, that careful hardening of something that had been, for just a moment, open. He had thought about that expression more than was strictly useful. Instead, he went riding. He rode for 2 hours across the estate, through the bare winter fields and along the frozen edge of the lake, and he thought about Marian, which he had been doing with increasing frequency and decreasing ability to pretend otherwise. He thought about her at dinner the first night, hand withdrawn to her lap. He thought about her talking about Gibbon with the contained excitement of someone who had long ago learned to keep their enthusiasm small. He thought about her in the entrance hall watching her mother's carriage leave, hands folded, face composed, giving nothing away to anyone who did not know what to look for. He was beginning, he realized, to know what to look for. This was either very good or very inconvenient. He strongly suspected it was both. Mrs. Voss arrived on Tuesday with her solicitor, a thin and careful man named Pratchett who carried his briefcase with the reverence of someone transporting something sacred. The Duke received them in the formal sitting room, which he had chosen deliberately. The formal sitting room was larger and colder than the drawing room, and the chairs were less comfortable, and there were no refreshments laid out, all of which conveyed, in the language of houses, exactly what he intended to convey. Mrs. Voss sat down and looked around the room, and understood all of it and smiled anyway. "Your Grace," she said, "how very good of you to see us." "Mrs. Voss, I expect you have some idea of why we have come." "I have your letter," he said. "Then you know that we wish to speak about Marian." She folded her hands in her lap, "and about a matter that has recently come to our attention regarding her circumstances." "Her parentage," the Duke said flatly. A slight pause, "just so. And how did this matter come to your attention?" Another pause, fractionally longer. "I have always known," she said. "Agnes told me before we married. I thought it best to understand the situation fully." The Duke looked at her. He thought about a woman named Agnes Voss, 19 years old, dismissed from a house with a letter of reference, and a sum of money and a child she was told never to speak of. He thought about her marrying a man who had known this and had presumably used it, in the way that certain people use the vulnerabilities of others, not cruelly perhaps, but as leverage, as insurance, as a way of making sure that the person beside them could never quite stand fully upright. He thought about Marian, growing up in that house, being made to feel like a circumstance. "What is it you want, Mrs. Voss?" he said. She smiled. It was a very practiced smile. "Only what is best for Marian, naturally." She opened her hand slightly, a gesture of openness that was entirely performance. "She is in a difficult position. Her parentage, if it were to become known, could cause complications for everyone involved, including, I would venture, for Ashford Park itself." "Is that a threat?" "It is an observation," she said pleasantly. "Mr. Pratchett has drawn up some thoughts on how the matter might be handled. A formal arrangement, an agreement regarding Marian's future that would satisfy all parties and ensure that this remains a private family concern." Mr. Pratchett opened his briefcase. The Duke held up one hand. "Before Mr. Pratchett shows me anything," he said, "I would like to ask you one question." "Of course." "In the arrangement you are proposing, has anyone asked Marian what she wants?" The smile did not falter, but something behind it went very still. "Marian," her mother said carefully, "is not always best placed to understand what is good for her." "I see," said the Duke. "Thank you, that is all I needed to know." He stood up. "Your Grace, I will need to speak with Miss Voss before any further conversation takes place," he said. "I am sure you understand. Mrs. Holt will see you to the drawing room." He found Marian in the east garden. She was walking along the dormant rose beds with her hands clasped behind her back and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps on the path with an expression that shifted, in the space of a second, from startlement to wariness. "Your mother is here," he said. She stopped walking. "I know, Peggy told me," a pause. "I thought it best to be outside." That was sensible. She looked at him. "What does she want?" He told her. He told her all of it, the letter, the solicitor, the arrangement that had not yet been named but whose shape was clear enough. He told her as he had told her everything else, without softening, because he had learned in the library that she did not want to be softened at. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at the rose beds, at the bare gray canes waiting for spring, and her face was very still. "She has always known," Marion said. "Yes. She has known since before I was born, essentially. Since before she married since before she married." She stopped, started again. "She has known what I was the entire time and she used it." "It appears so." "Not to hurt me," Marion said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Or not only that, to insure herself, to have something, in case she ever needed it." "Yes." She laughed then, very briefly, and it was not a happy sound, but it was not a broken one either. It was the sound of something finally making sense. "And now she needs it," Marion said, "so here we are." "Here we are," he agreed. She turned to face him fully. The wind had put color in her cheeks and loosened several strands of hair from their pins, and she looked, he thought, nothing like someone who was about to receive devastating news about her entire history, and everything like someone who had already, somewhere in the last few minutes, decided what she was going to do about it. "What is the arrangement she is proposing?" Marion asked. "She wants an agreement regarding your future, your parentage kept private. The details, I suspect, are to be determined based on what she thinks she can get." "And what does she think she can get?" "I believe," he said carefully, "that she is hoping I might be persuaded to formalize your position here, in exchange for her silence and her cooperation." Marion looked at him. "She wants you to marry me," she said, "not a question." "She wants to propose it as a solution," he said. "Yes." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that follows something that cannot be unsaid. Marion turned away. She looked at the rose beds again. Her shoulders were very straight. "And you," she said quietly, "what do you want?" He opened his mouth. And then she spoke again, and what she said was not what he expected. "It does not matter," she said. "I am sorry, that was unfair. None of this should fall to you." She turned back to him and her expression was resolved, and he recognized it as the expression of someone who had made a decision they intended to keep. "I will not be part of an arrangement. I said that before and I meant it. Whatever my mother is proposing, whatever she is threatening, I want no part of it. I will not be traded again." "Marion." "I will leave," she said. "Tomorrow, if you prefer. I have managed before and I will manage again. I am sorry for the trouble." She said it so matter-of-factly, so entirely without self-pity, that it was somehow worse than if she had wept. "You are not trouble," he said. "Your Grace." "You are not trouble," he said again, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. "And you are not going anywhere on the basis of your mother's threats. That is not," he stopped, collected himself. "That is not how this will go." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between hope and the long-practiced suspicion of hope. "Then how will it go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but not like that." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, back at the rose beds, and he saw her exhale slowly. "I will need to think," she said. "So will I," he said. They stood in the cold garden together, not quite looking at each other, while inside the house, in the formal sitting room, Mr. Pratchett's briefcase sat open on the table, and Mrs. Voss waited with the patience of a woman who had learned long ago that patience was its own kind of pressure. And in the kitchen corridor, Peggy stood very still with a tray of untouched refreshments, listening to the quiet from the garden, and decided that perhaps she would wait a little longer before going back inside. She made her decision sometime before dawn. Marion knew this because she had not slept, had not even tried, really, after the first hour of lying in the dark listening to the house breathe around her, and finding that its usual steadiness gave her no comfort tonight. She had lain on top of the covers with her hands folded on her stomach and stared at the ceiling and done what she had always done when a situation became untenable. She had thought it through to its logical end, removed all feeling from the equation, and arrived at the only conclusion that made any practical sense. She would leave. Not because she was afraid, though she was, a little. Not because the Duke had given her any reason to go, he had not, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that he had, in fact, given her more reason to stay than anyone had given her in a very long time, but because staying, now, meant something. It meant being part of whatever arrangement her mother intended to force into existence, and it meant the Duke being obliged to manage her as a consequence of her parentage, and it meant Ashford Park becoming a place that held her not because she had chosen it, but because circumstance and manipulation had left her no other option. She would not be held that way. She had been held that way her entire life, in a house where she had been tolerated rather than wanted, managed rather than loved, kept close enough to be useful and far enough away to be reminded daily that her closeness was conditional. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She knew the particular weight of it, the way it settled into the body over years until a person stopped being able to tell the difference between who they were and who they had been told to be. She was 23 years old. She did not want to spend the next 23 years learning the particular weight of a different kind of conditional belonging. So she would leave. She would find somewhere. She had a small amount of money saved, enough for a few weeks if she was careful, and she was always careful, and she would find a position as a governess or a companion or something else that required a person to be quiet and intelligent and unobtrusive, and she would build something small and stable and entirely her own, and it would be enough. It would have to be enough. She got up at 5 o'clock when the house was still dark and the fire had burned down to cold ash, and she dressed by feel in the gray half-light, pulling on her warmest dress, her heaviest cloak. She moved quietly, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had long practice in not being noticed. She did not light a candle. She packed her trunk efficiently, taking only what was hers, which was not very much, and leaving everything that had been provided by the house. The extra blanket, the nightgown Peggy had lent her when her own was damp from the laundry, the small book of household accounts that she had asked to look at once and been given, and had left sitting on the desk as a reminder to return it. She paused at the desk. She picked up the book and ran her thumb along its spine. Then she put it down again, because it was not hers. She picked up her trunk by the handle. She looked around the room one last time, the cold fireplace, the window seat with its faded blue and cream cushion, the pale gray light beginning to show at the edge of the curtains. She thought about the first night, the fire already lit, the small vase of winter greenery on the dressing table. She thought about Mrs. Holt's face when she had arrived. She thought about Peggy on the front steps, saying come in out of the cold, as if her comfort were the natural and obvious concern. She thought about the Duke in the garden yesterday, standing in the winter air with his hands at his sides, and something in his voice that she had not known what to do with and was still not sure she knew what to do with. And she thought very briefly, very carefully, and then deliberately closed the thought like a door, about what it might have meant. Then she picked up her trunk and went quietly out into the corridor. The house was entirely still. She moved through it carefully, keeping to the edges of the corridor where the floorboards were least likely to creak, another old habit, learned in a house where being heard moving at night had consequences. And she went down the servants' stairs rather than the main staircase, because the servants' stairs were narrower but quieter, and she knew them better by now, and she did not want to cross the entrance hall with its marble floors and high ceilings and the particular way sound traveled there. She reached the side door without incident. The cold air hit her immediately, sharp and clean and startling after the warm interior of the house, and she stood for a moment on the step adjusting to it, her breath a pale cloud in the early gray light. The sky was the color of pewter, lightening slightly at the horizon, and the gravel drive was silver with frost, and the bare trees at the edge of the park stood in dark silhouette against it, all like a painting she had once seen in a book and never forgotten. It was a very beautiful morning, in the bleak and uncompromising way that winter mornings in England often were. She picked up her trunk and walked. She had been on the road for perhaps 20 minutes, long enough for the house to have disappeared behind the curve of the drive, long enough for her feet to have registered their objections to the frozen ground beneath them, long enough for the first real doubt to have made itself known in the back of her mind and been firmly dismissed, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She told herself it was another traveler, an early rider from one of the neighboring estates, someone who had nothing to do with her. The hoofbeats slowed. She turned around. The Duke of Ashford sat on a gray horse, coatless, only his riding jacket, no hat, which told her he had come out in a hurry, looking down at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite relief, and was therefore something more complicated than either. She tightened her grip on her trunk. "You were not supposed to see this," she said. "I was awake," he said. "I heard the side door." "You heard," she stopped. "The house is very large. Sound travels in the morning." They looked at each other. The frost-pale road stretched between them and behind her, and the gray horse shifted its weight with a small and patient sound, and somewhere in the bare trees a single bird had begun to sing. "I am not going back," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not here to take you back." This was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself on the walk for various versions of this conversation, him telling her she was being impractical, him telling her she was obligated to stay, him telling her that her options were limited and she should be sensible. She had good answers ready for all of these. They had kept her company on the cold road. She did not have a good answer for "I am not here to take you back." "Then why are you here?" she said. He dismounted. He looped the reins over one arm and walked toward her through the frost, and he stopped when he was close enough that she could see his face properly in the morning light. The lines of it, the particular and guarded quality of his expression that she had spent the past weeks learning to read slowly, the way you learned a language that had no formal grammar. "Because I realized last night," he said, "that I have been approaching this entirely wrong." She waited. "I have been thinking about your situation as a problem to be managed," he said. "Your mother's threats, your parentage, what the county would say, what ought to be done. And in thinking about all of that, I managed to think very little about what you actually—" He stopped, started again. "I have been making decisions about your life without asking what you wanted from it. And I am aware that this is precisely what everyone else has always done. And I'm standing here at 6 o'clock in the morning in the frost telling you that I am sorry for it." She stared at him. In 23 years, no one had said those words to her, not once, not in that order and not meaning them. "Your mother," he continued, "will not get what she came for. I have already written to my solicitor. Whatever she is planning to threaten, it will not work, and she will be made to understand that clearly. Your parentage is your own information, and what you choose to do with it is your decision alone. I have no intention of using it as leverage of any kind." "Then what do you intend?" she said. Her voice was very careful. He looked at her for a long moment. "I intend," he said slowly, "to ask you what you want, not what is practical, not what solves the problem, what you actually want, and then I intend to listen to the answer." The bird in the trees had been joined by another. The sky was lightening, pale gold beginning to show at the edge of the pewter. The frost on the road was starting, barely, to soften. "That is a very unusual question," she said. "I know. No one has asked me that before." "I know that too," he said quietly. She looked down at her trunk. She looked at the road ahead of her stretching away into the pale morning. She looked at him. "If I told you what I wanted," she said carefully, "and if it was not what you expected, you would not hold it against me. No. You would not use it. No. How am I to know that?" He was quiet for a moment. "You are not," he said. "Not yet. That is the difficulty with trust. It cannot be proven in advance." He held her gaze. "But I am standing on a frozen road at 6 in the morning without my coat. I am not sure what else I can offer as evidence." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been careful not to do too directly since the first few days, because she had learned early that looking at the Duke of Ashford too directly was a complicated thing to do, for reasons she had been very conscientiously not examining. She looked at him now. He did not look away. "I want," she said slowly, "to go back." Something shifted in his face. "Not because I have nowhere else to go," she continued. "I want to be clear about that. I would find somewhere. I am not helpless." "I know you are not. And not because of any arrangement. There is no arrangement. And not," she stopped, started again. "I want to go back because when I am in that house I feel," she struggled for the word, found it. "Possible, I feel possible. And I have not felt that in a very long time, and I am not willing to give it up just because the situation is complicated." He was very still. "That is what I want," she said. "I wanted you to know." For a moment he said nothing. The morning light was strengthening around them, gold and gray and cold, and the horse shifted again quietly, and somewhere behind them, distant and unhurried, a clock in the house began to strike 6. "Then come back," he said, and his voice was different than she had heard it before, quieter, without the careful management she had come to recognize as his habitual mode of address. Just the words, plain and unguarded and meaning something she was not yet ready to name. She picked up her trunk. He reached out and took it from her hand before she could object. She let him. They walked back up the frost-pale drive together, the horse following behind them with the patient and amiable air of an animal that had seen stranger things, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said the important thing, and were taking a moment to understand that they had said it. Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen when they came in through the side door. She looked at Marian. She looked at the Duke. She looked at the trunk in the Duke's hand. Her expression remained entirely composed. "Breakfast will be ready in half an hour," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Marian said. Mrs. Holt nodded and returned to her work. But Peggy, who was standing at the far end of the kitchen with a basket of eggs, and who had been watching all of this with very wide eyes, caught Marian's gaze as she passed and broke into a smile so immediate and so unguarded that Marian almost smiled back before she could stop herself. She went upstairs. She put her cloak on the chair. She unpacked her trunk. She placed the small box of letters back in the drawer of the writing desk, and she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her heart doing something complicated and vigorous in her chest. And she thought that she would need to write a letter tonight, to no one in particular, in her usual way, and that, for the first time in years, she was not sure she would be able to keep it as brief as she usually did. There was rather a lot to say. Her mother left Ashford Park that afternoon. She did not go quietly, but she went. The Duke had spoken with her in the formal sitting room for precisely 23 minutes, Peggy counted, from the corridor, and when she emerged, she was wearing the expression of a woman who has discovered that the leverage she believed she had is considerably less effective than she had imagined. Mr. Pratchett's briefcase was still closed. Marian watched from the window of the east corridor as the black carriage rolled away down the gravel drive, and she felt not triumph exactly, not relief, something quieter than either of those things, something that had to do with doors closing and other doors possibly beginning to open. She was still standing at the window when she heard his footstep in the corridor. She did not turn around. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. "I could tell from her posture." A pause, and then, to her considerable surprise, she heard him make a sound that was very nearly a laugh. She turned around. He was not laughing, precisely, but something in his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something lighter, more unguarded than his usual expression, and it rearranged his features entirely, and she found herself looking at him again in that too direct way that she had been carefully avoiding. "She will try again," Marion said. "Perhaps," he said, "but she will find it considerably less productive." "What did you say to her?" He considered. "I told her that Miss Voss's circumstances were a private matter, and that any attempt to make them otherwise would be met with the full resources of this estate and its legal counsel, and that she should take the afternoon to consider how comfortable she was with that particular prospect." Marion looked at him. "You threatened her." "I informed her of the relevant facts," he said, with great precision. "With the full resources of the estate." "Which are considerable." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it entirely without qualification. He nodded once. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He looked slightly uncertain. Just for a moment. A small and human uncertainty that crossed his face and was quickly managed, but not quite quickly enough, and she caught it, because she had become very good at catching the things he was trying not to show. "There is something else," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the carriage had disappeared through the gate, and the gravel drive was empty again, and the winter light was beginning to soften toward afternoon. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that this morning I asked you what you wanted and you told me, and I am aware that I did not, that I responded to what you said, but I did not." He stopped. "I did not answer in kind." She waited. "What I want," he said, and his voice had that quality again, that unmanaged quiet, "is considerably more complicated to say than I had anticipated." "I am not in a hurry," she said. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you are." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that said several things at once and trusted the other person to understand them. And then he said, "Will you walk with me in the garden before the light goes?" It was such a simple thing to ask, such an ordinary thing, a walk in the garden before the light went. "Yes," she said, and went to get her cloak. They walked for a long time without speaking. This was, Marion had come to understand, one of the particular qualities of the Duke of Ashford. He did not fill silence because he was uncomfortable with it. He filled it only when he had something to say, and when he did not, he simply walked beside her through the frost-pale garden with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance. And the silence between them was so entirely without pressure that she found herself relaxing into it in a way she rarely relaxed into anything. She had spent her whole life in the company of people who used silence as a weapon, who let it stretch and sharpen until she felt compelled to fill it, to apologize into it, to offer something, anything to end it. She had learned to dread silence the way other people dreaded raised voices. Walking beside him, she did not dread it at all. They went along the east garden first, past the dormant rose beds and the bare pergola and the stone bench where she had sat on her first afternoon, not yet knowing the house well enough to find anywhere else to go. Then through the gate in the old yew hedge into the kitchen garden, where the winter vegetables stood in their patient rows, and the smell of cold earth rose up around them. Then out through the far end and around the edge of the park, where the ground rose slightly and you could see, if you turned, the whole west face of Ashford Park laid out against the gray sky, its stone walls and its ranked windows and the pale smoke rising from its chimneys. She turned. He turned too. They stood for a moment looking at it. "It is a very serious house," she said. "Yes," he said. "It has always seemed to me that it is waiting for something. I have never been entirely sure what. She looked at him. Do you like it? He considered this with the care he brought to everything. I was not asked whether I liked it, he said. It was given to me. I have tried to be worthy of it. That is not the same as liking it. No, he agreed. It is not, he paused. I like it better than I did, he said, lately. She looked back at the house and did not ask him what he meant, because she thought she knew, and the knowing of it was doing something considerable to her composure that she preferred to manage quietly. It was when they turned back toward the house that he spoke. Not about anything important at first. He told her about the estate, the history of it, the way it had come into his family 3 generations ago through a marriage that had been, by all accounts, almost entirely practical and had produced, against all reasonable expectation, a genuinely happy union. My great-grandmother planted the rose beds, he said. She brought the cuttings from her family's estate in Kent. My great-grandfather thought it was a considerable amount of trouble to go to for flowers. He said so, apparently, several times. And yet the roses are still there. And yet the roses are still there. Something moved in his voice. He outlived her by 20 years and never had them removed. There are letters, I found them once in the library, in which he writes about them to a friend. He says they are the only thing in the garden that still seems to know what it is doing. Marian looked at the rose beds as they passed them again, the bare canes moving slightly in the cold wind. That is one of the saddest things I have ever heard, she said. Yes, he said, I have always thought so too. They walked on. Do you read all the letters in the library? She asked. Most of them, eventually. A pause. It is a large library and I have spent a considerable number of winters here alone. She thought about that. About him in the library in the evenings, reading the letters of people who were no longer alive, learning the history of a house that had been given to him rather than chosen, in winters that stretched long and quiet around him. She thought about what that kind of solitude did to a person, not the solitude itself, which she understood well enough, but the particular shape of it, the way it settled differently in different people. Some people it made small and bitter. Some people it made large and strange. Some people it made very careful and very private and very attentive, because there had been no one to be attentive to, and the capacity had simply waited. She thought that perhaps that was what kind of solitude it had been for him. You knew about me, she said. Before you told me, you had time to decide what to do with it. Yes. And you decided to tell me. It seemed, he said, the only thing that was actually mine to decide. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean that the information was yours, he said. It belonged to you. I had found it, but that did not make it mine to keep. I was holding it, temporarily, and the right thing to do with something that belongs to someone else is to give it back. She was quiet for a moment. Most people, she said, would not have seen it that way. No, he said, I imagine they wouldn't. Most people would have used it. Yes. My mother certainly did. Your mother, he said, with a precision that was almost but not quite contempt, is a woman who has spent a great deal of energy acquiring things that do not belong to her. Marian thought about this. She thought about her childhood, the way her mother had always known exactly how much she could take and take and take before Marian would break, and had calibrated her behavior accordingly, never quite crossing the line into something that could be named, always retreating just far enough to make Marian question her own perception. She thought about being told she was difficult. She thought about being told she was ungrateful. She thought about being told, in 100 small and unremarkable ways, that her presence in that house was conditional on her usefulness, and her usefulness was defined entirely by her mother's needs. She thought about standing in the entrance hall of Ashford Park on her first day, and Mrs. Holt saying welcome, and the extraordinary thing that ordinary word had done to her. I did not understand, she said slowly, until I came here, how I did not know what it was supposed to feel like, To be in a place. He glanced at her. I thought everyone felt the way I felt in that house, she said. I thought that was simply what houses felt like, what families felt like. I thought I was the problem, that there was something in me that made it so difficult, something I was doing wrong, something I was failing to be. She paused. And then I arrived here and Peggy said come in out of the cold, and Mrs. Holt knew my name, and someone had lit my fire before I arrived. And I sat on the bed, and I could not understand why I wanted to cry. Because it was different, he said quietly. Because it was different, she agreed, and I had not known it could be. They had reached the side of the house, and they stopped without deciding to, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden in the failing afternoon light. The sky had turned from pewter to a deep and fading blue, and the first stars were beginning to show at the edges of it, and the cold had deepened with the dropping light in the way it did in England in winter, sudden and complete. She was cold. She had not noticed until now. He noticed. He noticed in the way she had come to understand. He noticed things quietly, without making a production of it, simply registering and responding. We should go in, he said. Yes, she said, but neither of them moved. He looked at her. She looked at him. And all the things that had been accumulating between them for weeks, all the quiet observations and the careful conversations, and the mornings in the library and the side door and the frost-pale road, all of it seemed to gather itself in the cold air between them and ask, in a voice she could not ignore, what she intended to do about it. I should tell you something, he said. Yes, she said, I think you should. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man who did not know what to say, but the silence of a man who was deciding how to say the thing he had known for some time he needed to say. I have not been, he stopped, started again. When you came here, I was not in the habit of expecting anything from anyone. I had become very settled in my own company. I had decided that this was simply how things were and that there was no particular reason to change them. She waited. And then you arrived, he said, with one trunk and a bruise on your wrist you were trying to hide, and you sat at the far end of my dinner table and said nothing and gave nothing away, and I could not stop watching you, which was entirely inconvenient, and I was not grateful for it. She almost smiled. I am sorry to have been inconvenient. You are not sorry at all, he said, and there was something in his voice now, a warmth so unguarded that she felt it as a physical thing. No, she admitted, not particularly. Good, he said, because I find that I am not either, not anymore. He turned to face her fully, and she turned to face him, and the garden was very still around them, and the cold stars were very bright overhead, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not accustomed to being aware of it. I am not proposing an arrangement, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am not proposing anything that has anything to do with your mother or your parentage or the complications thereof. I am telling you something that is entirely separate from all of that, and I need you to understand that it would be true regardless of everything else, regardless of who your father was, regardless of what your mother wants, regardless of what the county thinks or the solicitors say, or what is practical or what is not. She could not speak. I am telling you, he said, that this house has felt different since you came into it. I am telling you that I went to the library every night for a week not because of the records, but because it was where you had been. I am telling you that when you walked out this morning with your trunk, I felt something that I cannot call anything other than what it was. He paused. I am not a man who is given to speeches, Miss Voss. I am aware this is a poor one. But I would rather make it badly than not make it at all, because you have had entirely enough of people who have useful things to say to you and do not say them, and I do not wish to be another one. She stared at him. Her throat was very tight. What did you feel? She said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. This morning when I left. He held her gaze. That I had been given something, he said, without knowing it, and was about to lose it, and that losing it was not something I was willing to simply allow to happen. The cold air moved between them. That is, she said carefully, asterisk, a very considerable thing to say. Yes, he said, I know. And you are certain, she said, that it is not. It is not. You cannot know what I was going to say. You were going to ask me if I was certain it was not obligation or pity or some form of noblesse oblige dressed up as feeling, he said. And the answer is no. It is not any of those things. I am very clear on the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. How are you so sure, she said, that you know the difference? Because, he said quietly, pity does not keep me awake. Obligation does not make the library feel like the only room in the house worth being in, and noblesse oblige does not. He stopped. Something moved across his face. Does not make me think, when I watch you talk about a book, that I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you talk about books. She had been cold. She was not cold anymore. That, she said, after a moment, is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. It is a very low bar, he said, given the competition. It is, she agreed, and yet. He looked at her with something in his face she had never seen there before. All the careful management gone, just the thing itself, unguarded and undeniable, and she looked back at him with something she suspected was exactly the same. I would like, she said slowly, to be very clear about something. Please, he said. If I stay, and I am not yet saying I will, I am speaking hypothetically. Of course. It will be because I choose to, not because it is practical, not because there is nowhere else, not because of anything except that I am choosing it freely for myself. Yes, he said, that is the only way I want you to stay. And if I stay, she continued, I will not be managed, I will not be arranged, I will not be told what I am or what I am not, or what I may or may not say at dinner, or how much space I am allowed to take up. Good, he said. This house has too many empty rooms. She almost laughed. She felt it rise in her chest, surprising and warm and entirely real. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone simpler, she said honestly. Someone easier to keep at a distance. I apologize for the inconvenience, he said. You are not sorry at all, she said. No, he said, not particularly. They stood in the cold garden smiling at each other like two people who had just discovered that they had been speaking the same language all along without realizing it. And the stars were very bright, and the house behind them was warm and lit, its windows golden against the deep blue dark. And Marian thought that she would remember this moment, this exact moment, the cold air and the bare garden and his face in the last of the light, for the rest of her life. Hypothetically, she said, yes. If I were to stay. Yes. I think I should like to finish the Gibbon first. He looked at her for a moment. There are 4 more volumes, he said. I know, she said. I am a thorough reader. We have, he said, an excellent library. I am aware, she said. I have been making use of it. Then, he said, I suppose you had better come in. She looked up at the house, at the warm windows and the pale smoke and the door that had been left ajar, a thread of light falling out onto the frost. Yes, she said, and went inside. The weeks that followed were the quietest Marian had ever known, and she did not mean quiet in the way she had always meant it before, the quiet of being overlooked, of making herself small, of absence dressed up as peace. She meant quiet in the way of a room where everything is in its right place, the quiet of sufficiency. She finished the Gibbon. She started something else. She walked in the garden every morning regardless of the weather, which Peggy thought was eccentric and Mrs. Holt thought was sensible and the Duke thought was. She caught him watching from the library window on more than one occasion, and he did not pretend he hadn't been, which she found she appreciated enormously. They dined together every evening. They talked. About books at first, it was the safest ground, the most familiar, and then about other things. About the estate and its history. About the letters in the library and what they revealed about the people who had written them. About her childhood, gradually and in pieces, and about his, which had been lonely in a different way than hers, but lonely nonetheless. About the world, and how it was organized, and whether it ought to be organized differently, which led to arguments that were the most enjoyable arguments Marian had ever had, because he never once told her that her opinions were impractical or that she was getting above herself. He told her once that she was wrong about something. She told him why she wasn't. He listened. He reconsidered. He told her she had a point. She thought about that for several days afterward. He asked her in the fourth week if she would consider, at some point when she was ready, with no particular urgency, speaking with his solicitor about her parentage, not for the purpose of any arrangement, not for any purpose connected to her mother, simply to understand what her options were, what was legally hers to claim if she chose to claim it, what protections existed, what did not. "I do not want you to have options you don't know about," he said. "Whatever you decide to do with them is your own affair." She looked at him across the dinner table. "All right," she said. He nodded and returned to his plate and said nothing more about it, and she sat for a moment looking at the side of his face, the clean line of it, the unhurried way he moved through the world, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, slowly and with great care, as the particular weight of trust. Not given blindly, not given because she had no choice, given because the evidence, accumulated over weeks, pointed in one direction, and she was a thorough reader, and she had read it carefully. It was Mrs. Holt, who came to her one evening in the fifth week. Marian was in her room, writing at the small desk by the window, and she looked up when Mrs. Holt knocked and entered, which she did with her usual precision, and without the particular quality of hesitation that most people showed when they were about to say something difficult. Mrs. Holt simply came in and sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace, and looked at Marian with the expression she had worn since the first day, that expression of recognition, of something long held finally finding its proper home. "I owe you an explanation," Mrs. Holt said. "You do not." "I do," she said. "I have known who you were since the moment you arrived. I should have told you immediately. I chose instead to wait and to watch, and to hope that things would arrange themselves in a way that would make it easier to say." She paused. "I was a coward about it. I want you to know that I am aware of that." Marian looked at her for a long moment. "Were you afraid of what I would do?" she asked. "When I found out." "I was afraid," Mrs. Holt said slowly, of what it would cost you, finding out all at once without having had any time to feel safe here first. She looked at her hands briefly. "I remembered your mother. I knew what kind of house you had come from. I thought perhaps if you had a few weeks first, of simply being here, of knowing that this was a place that wanted you, perhaps then it would not be such a hard thing to land." The room was very quiet. Marian thought about the fire that had been lit in her room before she arrived, about the winter greenery on the dressing table, about Peggy on the front steps, about all the small and deliberate acts of welcome that she had thought were simply the ordinary way of this household, and understood now were something rather more specific than that. "You were protecting me," she said. "I was trying to," Mrs. Holt said. "I am not certain I did it correctly." "You did," Marian said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "You did it exactly correctly." Mrs. Holt looked at her. Something in her face, all that silver-haired precision, all that composed and measured restraint, shifted, very slightly. And what was underneath it was so simple and so old and so entirely without complexity that Marian felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "I held you," Mrs. Holt said quietly. "When you were born, your mother let me hold you for a few minutes before they took you away. You were very small and you looked very serious, and I thought—" She stopped, steadied. "I thought, Whoever this child grows into, she deserves better than what is about to happen to her." Marian could not speak. "I am glad," Mrs. Holt said, "that you are here." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the winter dark pressed against the window, and inside the room was warm and lit and entirely real. "So am I," Marian said, and meant it with everything she had. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like what she had imagined proposals to be. She had imagined when she had allowed herself to imagine, which had not been often, because imagining things that were not going to happen had always seemed like a particular cruelty to herself, that proposals were formal events, orchestrated, a man on a knee in a drawing room, specific and stageable language. It happened in the library. Of course it happened in the library. She had been reading, and he had been writing letters, and the fire had burned down comfortably between them, and the evening had settled into that particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand as belonging specifically to this room, to this configuration of two people who had discovered, slowly and without intending to, that they were simply better in the same space than out of it. He set his pen down. She turned a page. "Marian," he said. She said, "I would like to marry you." She turned another page, then stopped, looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know best, that particular quality of attention, patient and unhurried and entirely focused, the expression of a man who had decided something and was waiting to find out if the world agreed. "That," she said, "was not a question." "No," he said, "it was not. I know my own mind." A pause. "But your answer is a question, obviously, if you want it to be." She looked at him. She thought about the frost-pale road and the library evenings and the rose beds and Gibbon and the dinner table and every conversation they had ever had. And she thought about what she had told him in the garden, "I feel possible." And she thought about what it meant that she still felt that way, weeks later, and felt it more rather than less, and felt it most strongly in exactly this room, in exactly this chair, with exactly this man writing letters at his desk in the firelight. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I will marry you," she said clearly. "Not because of anything except that I want to. Is that sufficiently clear?" "Perfectly," he said. "Good," she said, and returned to her book. He sat for a moment looking at the side of her face. Then he picked up his pen. But he did not write anything for quite some time. The wedding was small. Not because either of them lacked the means for something larger, but because neither of them wanted it. Marian had no family she wished to invite. Her mother received a letter informing her of the marriage after the fact, which was the Duke's idea, and one of the things she loved him for most. And the Duke had a small and scattered family who sent congratulatory letters with varying degrees of surprise. Mrs. Holt organized everything with her usual precision, and wept on the day with a completeness that surprised no one who knew her. Peggy cried louder, and was entirely unashamed of it. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the estate, attended by the household staff, and two of the Duke's oldest friends and Mr. Callum the steward, who stood very straight throughout, and seemed to be experiencing feelings he was not accustomed to having. Marian wore her best dress, which was not particularly fine, and carried a small bunch of winter greenery because there were no flowers, and walked into the chapel beside Mrs. Holt, who had offered her arm with a composure that lasted exactly until they reached the door. "Ready," Mrs. Holt said. Marian looked ahead, at the chapel interior, at the small gathered faces, at the Duke standing at the front with his hands clasped and his expression performing calm with limited success. "Yes," she said. She was. 1 year later, spring had come to Ashford Park in the particular way it always did, gradually, and then all at once, so that one morning you looked out of the window and the rose beds, which had been bare gray canes for months, were suddenly and improbably green. Marian noticed from the library window. She set down her book. "The roses," she said. He looked up from his desk. "So they are," he said. She stood and went to the window and pressed her hand flat against the glass, looking down at the garden. The sun was warm on the window, genuinely warm for the first time since autumn, and the green was very bright against the dark soil, and she stood there for a moment simply looking at it. Behind her, she heard him set down his pen. "Come outside," he said. They went out through the side door and around the edge of the house and into the east garden, where the rose beds stretched in their long rows, and the new growth was so green it seemed almost improbable, and the air smelled of turned earth and something else, something she had no name for, which was simply the smell of things beginning. He walked beside her along the beds. "Your great-grandmother," she said. Do you think she knew they would still be here?" "I think," he said, "that she planted them because she wanted them to be. Whether they would be was not entirely in her control." Marian looked at the new green canes. "That is a very sensible way to plant roses," she said. She was, by all accounts, a very sensible woman. "I would have liked her." "I think," he said, "she would have liked you considerably better than she liked most people." She smiled. She had gotten better at smiling, at letting it happen without immediately questioning what it cost. That had taken time. She was not entirely certain she was finished yet. But she was better than she had been, and better than she had been was more than she had once thought she was capable of. She stopped walking and turned her face up to the sun. It was warm, genuinely properly warm, the kind of warmth that asked nothing of you, that simply was and let you be in it. She heard his footstep on the path beside her. She opened her eyes. He was watching her. He watched her the same way he always had, from the very beginning, that patient and unhurried attention, as if she were worth looking at carefully, as if there were no urgency, as if he had all the time there was and was glad to spend it exactly here. She had never stopped finding it remarkable. She hoped privately that she never would. "Mrs. Holt wants to know," he said, "whether you want the east sitting room repapered this summer, or whether you prefer to wait until autumn." "Summer," she said. "The blue, we discussed it." "I will tell her." "You could let me tell her." "You could," he agreed, "or I could since I am going inside." "Then tell her summer and the blue," she said, "and tell her also that I would like tea in the garden if it stays warm, and that Peggy may bring it out if she wants some air." "Peggy always wants some air." "I know, that is why I said it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to love best, that small and private thing, that warmth he reserved for moments when there was no one watching, which she had come to understand was not warmth reserved for her but warmth that she had called out of him, that had not been there before she came. She had not known, when she arrived at this house with one trunk and a bruise she was trying to hide, that she had anything to give anyone. She knew better now. He went inside. She stayed in the garden. She walked slowly along the rose beds, trailing her fingers along the new green growth, and she thought about Agnes Voss, who had been 19 years old and alone and had kept her anyway. She thought about Mrs. Holt holding a baby in a room she had never seen, thinking she deserves better. She thought about all the distances between that beginning and this morning, this garden, this warmth. She stopped at the end of the beds. She looked back at the house, the stone face of it, the ranked windows, the pale smoke from the kitchen chimney, the window of the library where the curtain had been moved slightly to one side. She raised her hand. After a moment, the curtain moved back. She turned to the roses. The first bud of the season was there at the very end of the last bed, small and tight and very green, just beginning to show the faintest edge of color at its tip. Not open yet, not quite, but present, undeniable, doing with great patience and no drama exactly what it had always been going to do. She crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up, brushed the earth from her hands, and went inside to order the tea. She had arrived with one trunk and a bruise she tried to hide. She had not known, then, what she was walking into. She had not known about the fire already lit, or the woman who had held her once and never forgotten, or the man at the window who would turn back from his ride and spend the better part of a year discovering that the thing he had not known he was waiting for had arrived in a carriage on a gray morning in winter, and pulled her sleeve down over her wrist and walked toward his house alone. She knew now. She had learned it the way she had learned everything worth knowing, slowly, carefully, and by paying attention. It had been, she thought, the best kind of education,